does the Union think if they march down and win at, if they get a decisive victory, they can maybe end the war at any time?
Is it Vicksburg?
Not yet. No, think about it. Where'd they try to go in the first Battle of Bull Run?
Oh,
Richmond. So there's still the kind of the overall thought process on the part of the Union is if we can get down to Richmond and we can hammer out a victory at Richmond, we still think that these Confederates are going to quit. Okay, even though we find out in history they're not, that's still their thought process. Yes, they're still trying to cut the Confederacy in half, and they will work on Vicksburg. But they still have in the back of their minds, you know, if we just get ourselves together here and get down to Richmond and put it on them in Richmond, they'll quit. Now, after the first Battle of Bull Run, and we're back in the Eastern Theater, Lincoln changed overall commanders. And who was the overall commander at the time? Winfield Scott. And Lincoln gives overall command of Union forces to General George McClellan. General George McClellan, who's on your ID sheet. This will be another change of many that will happen on the part of the North during the Civil War. So after the first Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln gave overall command of the Union Army to General George McClellan. And what did he figure out after the first Battle of Bull Run? That Union troops were not what? What? Very good. They weren't well trained. We thought we were just going to march in there with raw recruits on 90-day enlistments, kick some rear end and be done. Well, McClellan was smart enough to figure out that, you know, these troops are not properly trained. So he wanted to better train the Union Army and prepare them before he took them out into battle again. So once he fully prepares these Union troops and trains them correctly, then we'll turn them loose on another campaign. Now, McClellan's thinking this, you know, we weren't very ready the first time, went down there, got our fannies kicked. We'll get these guys really well prepared and trained. We'll go back and do it again. And we'll fight them near Richmond, and we'll whip them in Richmond, and they'll quit. We just made the mistake of not being ready the first time. That's kind of his thought process. So, once the Union troops are properly prepared for battle, the Union's going to approach the Confederate capital of Richmond again from Washington, D.C. Now, the strategy in the Eastern Theater for the Union was to cross both the York and the James Rivers, capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, and end the war in favor of the North. That was the strategy in the Eastern Theater under McClellan. They would march towards Richmond. They would cross both the York and James Rivers. They would march in and capture that Confederate capital of Richmond and win the Civil War for the North. Now, this strategy on the part of McClellan is going to result in numerous battles between the North and South in the area around what? Richmond. So these major battles in the Civil War in the Eastern Theater, the first ones are going to be in Virginia and around the area of Richmond. And we're going to talk about several of those battles. The first being the Battle of Fair Oaks. What do you need, Marco? Okay, I repeat these lots, so keep after, keep listening. Okay, the Battle of Fair Oaks is going to be the first of these many battles between Union and Confederate forces around Richmond. And it's going to occur in April of 1862.
Is this the next up?
Yeah, the Battle of Fair Oaks, yeah. Did I give you a sheet? You get a sheet here?
Yeah.
Now, the Union Army marches towards Richmond in April of 1862, and they stop at Fort Monroe, Virginia. They stop at Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is about 70 miles from Richmond. So the Union forces under the command of George McClellan march from Washington, D.C. towards Richmond, and they stop at Fort Monroe, Virginia, which is about 70 miles from Richmond. Now, the Confederate troops are near Richmond, real close to Richmond, and they're badly, badly outnumbered. So Confederate troops that are protecting Richmond are just outside Richmond, and they're badly, badly outnumbered. And so what are they waiting for, Emily? What are they waiting for? They're outnumbered, so they're waiting for something. Reinforcements. They're waiting for reinforcements. And these reinforcements are coming under the command of General Joe Johnston. So Confederate General Joe Johnston is supposed to be bringing reinforcements to reinforce these Confederate troops near Richmond who are badly outnumbered. So these rebels that are stationed outside Richmond are waiting for reinforcements under the command of General Joe Johnston. Now, they're scared because they know who's on the way. The Union. Okay? So, to hide the fact that they're so outnumbered, Confederate soldiers were ordered to do the following two things. Okay? They were afraid that this Union army was going to come in and run right over the top of them. And to hide the fact they were so outnumbered, hoping to kind of stall that Union advance, these are the two things they did. First of all, they marched back and forth as loudly as possible to make the Union Army believe there were many more soldiers than they had. You remember what Washington did back when they rolled barrels? Also tended to many deception, and that's what the Civil War also occurred in the Civil War. And this time the Confederates are trying to hide the fact they're so outnumbered, and the first thing they do is they march back and forth loudly, as loud as they can, to make it seem as if there are many more soldiers there than there really were. The other thing they did, which was kind of simple but ingenious, is they took large logs and they painted them black and set them upright so they looked like what from a distance? Set them like this. Cannons. Cannons. Okay? So the rebels painted large logs black. They sat them upright, making them look like cannons from a distance. But while they're doing this, Union General McClellan is marching his men from Fort Monroe, Virginia, towards Richmond, and he stops at White House Landing, Virginia. So they march from Washington, D.C. to Fort Monroe, Virginia, which was about 70 miles from Richmond, rest a while, continue their march, and they stop at White House Landing, Virginia. And McClellan halted his march. He stopped. What's he doing? What's he waiting for? Why didn't he just march in? What's he doing? He's got them outnumbered vastly, but he stops and waits for what? No? His own reinforcements. Okay? And remember General Irvin Mcdowell, that was a Union general during the first Battle of Bull Run? He was scheduled to join McClellan's forces with about 55,000 soldiers. So McClellan's at White House Landing, Virginia, vastly outnumbering these Confederates at Richmond, but stops and waits for General Irvin Mcdowell to arrive with 55,000 more Union soldiers. Now, you're the Confederate Army. It's vastly outnumbered at Richmond. What in the world is your strategy once you find out that McClellan has stopped at White House Landing waiting for reinforcements numbering 55,000?
Go surround White House.
What's that? What would you
Go
do?
surround White House Landing.
With what? Your undermanned troops?
The giant black wall.
I mean, you're in bad shape. What are you going to do? You're going to try to keep McDowell from getting to McClellan. Okay? And whose job is that going to be? To keep the Union reinforcements from arriving at White House Landing. Anybody want to guess which Confederate general is going to take on that task we talked about? Standing
Jackson.
Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. So, the Confederate Army, which is stationed at Richmond, knew that if McClellan received these Union reinforcements, it would result in a disastrous defeat for the Confederates. So because of this, the Confederates need to stop the Union reinforcements from reaching General McClellan, and the man assigned this awesome task would be Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. And it will be his responsibility to keep the Union reinforcements from arriving to General McClellan. Now, this is really kind of an interesting story. It tells you a little bit about Stonewall Jackson. With a force of approximately 18,000 rebels, Stonewall Jackson intercepts Union General McDowell and his 55,000 soldiers. So with a rebel force of about 18,000, Stonewall Jackson intercepts Union General McDowell and his 55,000 soldiers that are heading to where? White House Landing. Okay, intercepts them. And Jackson and his rebel army fight McDowell and his Union army in a series of battles in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So in a separate skirmish, Stonewall Jackson and his 18,000 rebels fight a series of battles against McDowell's forces in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And because of his engaging of those particular Union soldiers, they do not get to White House Landing to join McClellan and his soldiers. But who does get where they're supposed to get? Joe Johnston and his rebel reinforcements arrive near Richmond to support the Confederates. So now we got a battle that's going to be kind of even-steven. Does that make sense? So Jackson intercepts McDowell. They fight in a series of battles in the Shenandoah Valley, which prevents McDowell and his 55,000 soldiers to reinforce McClellan. However, Joe Johnston and those Confederate reinforcements do arrive to support those particular soldiers there. And they have a battle between the Confederates and McClellan's army, which is known in history, Civil War history, as the Battle of Fair Oaks. So the Battle of Fair Oaks, all I've told you is setting us up for this battle. So the battle itself is between the original soldiers that McClellan marched from Washington, D.C. against the Confederates that were so badly outnumbered at Richmond that were reinforced by General Joe Johnston. And now we're going to have a battle. And that battle is going to be called the Battle of Fair Oaks. Now let's just figure it out. It's pretty simple. If the Union wins, what's possibly over? Civil War. If the Confederates win, we're back kind of to square one again on the Union strategy. Well, the Battle of Fair Oaks was won by the Confederates. It stops the Union advance to Richmond, and again, the Union fails to strike a blow to capture the Confederate capital and put an end to the Civil War. So the Confederates win the Battle of Fair Oaks. Again, they stop the Union from striking a blow to capture the Confederate capital and possibly putting an end to the Civil War. Now, we've had this already in part one, now we're going to have it in part two. Here comes the second tactical mistake of the Civil War, this time made by the North. And what is it, Elise? What is that second tactical mistake? What should have happened differently that maybe would have made a difference in this Battle of Fair Oaks?
Maybe not waiting for the reinforcements.
Very good. If the Union doesn't wait for the reinforcements, they go in and probably destroy the Confederates at Richmond because they're so outnumbered and possibly end the Civil War. So the second major tactical mistake of the Civil War comes on the part of the Union. When McClellan waits for reinforcements at White House Landing, Virginia, instead of going on the offensive and attacking those undermanned Confederates stationed there. Once the Confederates got their reinforcements and Stonewall Jackson kept McClellan from getting his, we had a fair fight, so to speak, won by the Confederates. Make sense? Okay, that's the Battle of Fair Oaks and what we set and its setup. Now, that's going to take us to our next important subtopic, which is Robert E. Lee's tough decision. Robert E. Lee, the most famous, maybe the most famous other than Grant, or they're pretty even here, in Civil War history, hasn't even come into the picture yet during the Civil War. He hasn't even come in the picture. So everything we've talked about thus far all happened without Robert E. Lee. Okay? Now, Robert E. Lee's trip into history all begins because Confederate General Joe Johnston, who brought those reinforcements in and fought at the Battle of Pharos, was wounded and had to be replaced. He was wounded and had to be replaced. Could no longer fight. And they were looking for a replacement for Confederate General Joe Johnston. And the man the South wanted to replace him was a Virginian by the name of Robert E. Lee, a native of Virginia. Now remember, Virginia split up, didn't they? The western part stayed loyal, the other part went to the Confederacy. So we'll kind of talk about this a little bit. Now, what is the first time we've talked about Robert E. Lee? What rank was he? When he defeated John Brown in the rebellion at Harper's Ferry, he was just a colonel, right? So after after the Confederate assault on Fort Sumter, which started this Civil War, Robert E. Lee was a colonel in the Union Army, right? He's a colonel in the Union Army after the fall of Fort Sumter. Well, at the time, Colonel Lee's home was in the state of Virginia. And after Fort Sumter, they were leaning towards seceding from the Union. Well, we'll go back to April of 1861, when who was the overall commander of Union forces? Winfield Scott. In April of 1861, Colonel Robert E. Lee receives a message from General Winfield Scott, who's the overall commander of Union forces, and General Scott requested Colonel Lee come and visit with him at General Scott's home. This is April of 1861, not long after Fort Sumter, right? Before some of this other stuff we've talked about. So we're kind of going back a little bit in the story. So back in April of 1861, Colonel Robert E. Lee had received a message from General Scott, who was the overall commander of Union forces, appointed by Lincoln, and Scott requested that Colonel Lee come visit him at his home. Well, Robert E. Lee and Winfield Scott were good friends. Lee actually fought under Scott's command when? Which war? Mexican War. So they were good friends. Winfield Scott, the overall commander of Union forces, and Colonel Robert E. Lee were really good friends. Lee had fought under Scott in the Mexican War. Well, when Colonel Lee arrived at Scott's home, General Scott offered him the following two things. Okay? When Robert E. Lee arrived at General Winfield Scott's home in April of 1861, the general offered him two things. What do you think he offered him? First thing you might be, what would be the first carrot you might offer a guy to try to get him to your side? Very good. From colonel to general. So the first thing Lee was offered was a promotion in the Union Army from colonel to general. What's the second thing he offered him if he would take that? No? Think. What? No? What was General Aging Winfield Scott at the time? He offered him to be overall commander of Union forces in the Civil War. So, when General Lee arrives at General Scott's home, he offers him a promotion from the rank of colonel, that of general in the Union Army, and then he offers him the overall command of the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, who was really offering him this? It just was going through
Lincoln.
Scott. Abe Lincoln. This actually was coming from President Lincoln through Scott's mouth. So even though Scott was the one offering it, the original offer was officially coming from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Well, you got to think back. Virginia had not seceded yet. And see, he didn't know what the intentions of his native state were going to be. And because he didn't know what they were going to do, he turns down General Scott's offer. Not because he had made up his mind. Do you follow what I'm saying here, kiddos? It's because he didn't know what his native state of Virginia was going to do. And more than likely wanted to wait to see. Okay? So he turned him down because he didn't know what his native state was going to do. Once his native state seceded from the Union, what did Lee do? Resigned his command in the Union Army and enlisted in the Confederate Army. So Lee turned Scott and President Lincoln down first because he didn't know what Virginia did. If Virginia would have stayed loyal to the Union, history would have been a little different, right? Because Lee would have stayed with the Union. But when Virginia seceded from the Union, he resigned from the United States Army after serving 30 years. Then rode to Richmond and volunteered to serve the Confederate States of America. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? I just think that's a great story. Well, what did President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy do as soon as Lee volunteered to serve the Confederate? Gave him the rank of and overall command of the Confederate Army. Quite a turnaround.
Who gave him that ranking?
President Jefferson Davis. Remember, he was the president of the Confederacy. So as soon as President Jefferson Davis finds out that Robert E. Lee volunteers to serve his native state of Virginia in the Confederacy, he promotes him to the rank of general and gives him overall command of the Confederate forces. See how quick that switched? That's pretty incredible when you think about it. Over which way a state went. Now, when this bad news reached General Winfield Scott, he was quoted as saying, "The United States lost the very